People ask me what it was like to be there. I tell them the truth. I was 14 years old and I was cold, and I was standing in a service corridor outside the secondary observation blister because my father had told me to stay in our quarters and I had not listened. I never told him that until years later. By then it didn't matter. By then there was nothing left to matter. The Cassiel was a diplomatic frigate. She was not a small ship by civilian measure, 300 meters from bow to engine array, crew of 82 plus the attaché staff my father ran, but she was not a warship. Nobody aboard the Cassiel had any illusions about what she was. She had light point defense guns on her flanks, enough to discourage pirates and nothing more. The hull was the pale sand color that the diplomatic corps used on every vessel they sent into contested space, the color that said to whoever was watching, "We came to talk." The Veyrath Sovereignty was watching. I didn't know much about them at 14. I knew what my father had briefed us on during the transit: 4 weeks in jump, 2 more crossing Veyrath territorial space under escort permission. I knew they were old, older than most civilizations in this region of the galaxy, and that their culture was built around the idea of the hunt. Not the brutish hunt, my father said, but the patient one. The kind where you study your quarry for years before you move. The kind where the moment of revelation was everything. Where the instant an apex predator made itself known to find, in that culture's terms, what it was. That was what they valued. The reveal. The moment of being seen. He had spent a long time preparing me for it, not in the way of a man coaching his child for an appearance, but in the way of a man who wanted someone else to understand something he found genuinely difficult to articulate. The Veyrath don't negotiate the way we do, he told me, sitting at the small folding desk in our shared cabin on the second week of transit. They don't trade concessions. They take a reading. They wait. And when they're satisfied they've read you correctly, they act on it. Everything we say to them for the next several weeks is a reading. Everything we don't say is also a reading. I asked him what we wanted them to read. He thought about it for a moment. The truth, he said. Which is harder than it sounds, when the truth is something most people find uncomfortable. I asked what the truth was. He smiled at that. The kind of smile that carried more weight than the expression itself. He said, "Ask me again in a few weeks." I was still thinking about that conversation when we dropped out of jump into Veyrath space and the escort frigates materialized on our flanks, 2 on each side, close enough that their running lights were visible through the porthole, and I could see the detail on their hulls. The sharpness of the line work. The way their design language said nothing but function, because for 3,000 years the Sovereignty had been building things to do exactly what they said they would do and nothing ornamental about any of it. My father watched them fall into position and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Good. They're serious." I wasn't sure whether that was reassuring. The diplomatic exchange had been going on for 11 hours by the time I slipped out of quarters. My father was in the forward conference compartment with Warmaster Arev and 2 of the Sovereignty's senior cast officials via long-range visual link. The link was a courtesy. The Veyrath formation was holding at 4,000 kilometers. Close enough for optical. Close enough that through the observation blister I could see their ships against the backdrop of the Aerith gas giant. 5 warships in a crescent formation, hull dark in the amber light, angular in the way that predatory evolution always seemed to produce when it reached space. Sharp lines. Nothing wasted. The Sovereignty built its ships to look like what it was. 11 hours of careful language, my father had said at dinner the night before. 11 hours of the Veyrath testing every sentence for weakness, for evasion, for the gap between what a civilization said and what it was. They had, apparently, very good instruments for finding that gap. I pressed my face against the viewport and watched their lead warship, the Arev-class Sovereign vessel. I had looked up the designation in the Cassiel's recognition files after my father had briefed us. 1,700 meters from stem to command spire. Main batteries capable of cracking a moon's crust if you aimed low enough and were patient about it. The Sovereignty did not bring their sovereign vessels to diplomatic first exchanges as a rule. It was, my father had explained, considered excessive. A statement of confidence that bordered on contempt. They had brought this one anyway. As a way of saying, this is what we are. We would like to see, diplomatically, what you are. I found out later, much later, reading the transcripts, that the exchange in those 11 hours had gone exactly as the Sovereignty's cast protocols demanded. They had probed the language. They had questioned the composition of the delegation. They had asked, in terms my father said required careful handling, Why a civilization of humanity's claimed reach had sent a single unarmed frigate to a first contact with the sovereign power of the Veyrath standing. They had asked it 4 times, in 4 different registers, and each time my father had given them a variant of the same answer, which was, because we came to talk. The Sovereignty's cast officials had accepted this answer and then continued probing, which my father said was the correct response and which he had expected. What he had been calibrating across 11 hours was the moment when the probing would give way to the question. The real question. The one the Sovereignty had been building toward since we dropped out of jump. Then, with a precision my father had spent 20 years learning to anticipate, the Warmaster had asked it. I didn't hear it spoken. I pieced it together afterward from the recording. The Warmaster had looked at my father, a civilian, a diplomat, a man who carried no weapons and made no pretense of doing so, and asked him, in terms the translation matrix rendered as something close to, "Is this all you brought?" A sovereign vessel and 4 escort frigates against 1 unarmed diplomatic ship. The formation had held for 11 hours. The question was the conclusion of everything that holding implied. Is this all you brought? My father had paused. The transcript showed a 3-second gap. I've listened to that gap many times in the years since, and I've decided he was not composing an answer. He already had the answer. He was simply deciding, in those 3 seconds, how much of himself he wanted visible in the moment that followed. He was, in his way, a man who understood the Veyrath better than they expected. He said, "Captain Morev, if you please." I was at the viewport when it happened. There is no sound in space. The observation blister gave me nothing but light, and even light takes time. What I saw first, and I don't think I breathed during any of it, was the distortion. Not an explosion, not a flash, not anything dramatic in the cheap sense. A distortion, like heat shimmer above summer pavement, except it was happening against the backdrop of the Veyrath giant and the cold dark around it, and it was happening in 4 places simultaneously, and then the shimmer resolved. They had been there the whole time. 4 Terran dreadnoughts. Not the trim diplomatic kind, not the mid-class patrol hulls I had seen docked at Reach Station when we departed. These were the long ones. The blocky, hard-shouldered, panel-scarred kind that the fleet sent when it wanted the answer to a question to be beyond any reasonable interpretation. Each one was longer than the Cassial boat astern by a factor of 5. Their hull lights were running, not combat bright, not alarm red, just the normal amber navigation beads along each superstructure ridge, and even at distance I could see the gun emplacements along their flanks, the turret housings, the massive material that went into building something designed to last through the things those ships had been built to survive. They had been there for 11 hours. Running cloaked, holding position, listening to the exchange, waiting for the one question and the one answer. The Veyrath formation went still. Not silent on comms. I found out later that the Sovereignty ships produced a great deal of internal traffic in those first seconds, the kind of volume that suggested something systematic was being reconsidered at speed. But visually, in the amber light of the gas giant, they went very still. The sovereign vessel did not maneuver. The escort frigates did not maneuver. The 4 Terran dreadnoughts held their positions in easy silence, gun turrets turned away from the Veyrath ships in a deliberate, measured pace, as if the answer to "Is this all you brought?" had already been fully said and there was nothing left to add. 4:41 seconds, by the transcript clock, nothing moved. Then the Warmaster transmitted. 1 word. The translation matrix rendered it in the logs as "acknowledged." But that wasn't quite right. My father told me this later, sitting in the Cassial's small crew lounge with his jacket undone, looking tireder than I had ever seen him look. The word the Warmaster used was closer to the Veyrath term for the moment a hunt resolves. The moment you understand, not as information but as fact settled in the body, what you are dealing with. It was the word, he said, that a Veyrath used when they had looked at something and it had looked back and neither party was pretending any more about what they were. There is not a clean translation for it. Acknowledged is the closest the matrix could manage. My father preferred, "Now we know." I was still at the viewport when I heard the hatch behind me open. I knew it was him before I turned. I knew his step, the slight irregularity in it from an old planetary survey injury he'd never had properly treated, and the particular quality of quiet that travelled with him when he was moving carefully and not wanting to startle someone. He stood beside me at the viewport. He did not tell me I should have been in quarters. He looked out at the same thing I was looking at, for human dreadnoughts in amber light, holding formation in the dark, their gun housings turned away from the Veyrath ships. The Sovereignty's vessels were still holding, still deciding what the next word was going to be. He put his hand on my shoulder. Not to steer me away. Not to say anything. Just a hand on the shoulder, the specific weight of it, while we stood at the viewport together and watched the history resolve itself in the slow amber light of a gas giant 400 million kilometers from any world either of us had ever called home. I am 53 years old. I have been on a dozen diplomatic missions since, 3 of them to Veyrath space, and the Sovereignty and the Reach have maintained something that functions as a working accord for going on 30 years now. My father did not live to see all of it. He died 11 years after the Cassiol's mission, quietly, in a hospital in Reach's capital, the old survey injury having decided to finish what it started. He was 68. He had done everything he had set out to do, and a good deal more besides. There are things I know now that I didn't know at 14. I know the 4 dreadnoughts had been in position since 12 hours before we dropped out of jump. I know that Captain Morev held them cloaked on my father's standing order, and that the order had been worded with the same precision my father brought to everything. Hold until the Warmaster asks the question they always ask. I know that when the Warmaster transmitted that single word, Morev's communication log shows he copied it to my father with one line appended. As expected, attaché vos. As expected. I know that my father read that and didn't reply. There was nothing to reply. The reading had been taken. The reveal had happened, not by accident, not by aggression, but by the same patient logic the Sovereignty had spent 3,000 years refining. You study your quarry. You wait. And when the moment comes, you make yourself known, and you do it on your own terms, and you leave nothing ambiguous about what you are. My father had understood that. He had given the Veyrath, on the first day they met humanity, exactly the experience they valued most. He had let them look, and he had let them look for exactly as long as they needed to look, and then he had let the answer show itself. I think about his hand sometimes. The weight of it. The fact that he came to find me in a service corridor when he could have called me on comms, when he could have sent one of the staff, when he had more than enough reason to be doing something else entirely. He came to the viewport. He stood with me. He put his hand on my shoulder and we watched the 4 dreadnoughts hold in the amber dark, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Now we know. He carried that phrase for the rest of his life. He used it in the title of the account he wrote for the Diplomatic Corps Archive, the one that became required reading for anyone assigned to first contact preparation. He used it in speeches. He used it, in the last months, when I visited him in their hospital and we talked about the things a person talks about when time is running short. I have kept it, too. I have kept it for nearly 40 years, and I intend to keep it for whatever comes after. Now we know.